There is a stretch of highway in the Nevada desert so remote that the nearest gas station is 60 miles in any direction. The road cuts through a valley flanked by mountain ranges, so old they have no names on modern maps. And the sky above them at night is so dark and so crowded with stars that first-time visitors sometimes pull over just to catch their breath. People who grew up on this road do not describe it as lonely. They describe it as watched. The highway is officially called Nevada State Route 375. In 1996, the state of Nevada renamed it the Extraterrestrial Highway, partly as a tourism gimmick, partly because the locals had been calling it that for decades anyway. Roughly 90 miles northwest of Las Vegas, if you turn off the main road and drive another 13 miles down a dirt path that the military calls nothing at all, you will arrive at a perimeter fence. Beyond that fence is a restricted airspace larger than the state of Connecticut. Beyond that airspace, on the floor of a dry lake bed, ringed by mountains, sits a facility that the United States government did not officially acknowledge existed until 2013. The facility is called Area 51. The people who grew up next to it are not who you would expect. They are not conspiracy theorists. They are not basement researchers with red string and photographs pinned to corkboards. They are ranchers and school teachers and mechanics and retired nurses. They are people who spent their childhoods watching the sky because the sky in that valley is one of the few things worth watching. And what they saw in that sky over the course of 30, 40, 50 years changed the way they understand the world. Not in dramatic fashion, not all at once, but slowly, quietly, the way a person changes when they keep seeing something they cannot explain, and nobody around them is willing to talk about it. This is their story. The community closest to the base is a place called Rachel, Nevada. Rachel sits at an elevation of nearly 5,000 feet, and in the 1980s, it had a population of around 100 people. Today, that number has dropped to somewhere between 50 and 100, depending on the season. There is one business in Rachel. It is a bar and motel called the Little A-Linn, and its walls are covered in photographs, newspaper clippings, and hand-drawn illustrations submitted by people passing through who say they saw something in the sky above the valley and needed someone to believe them. The owner has been collecting these for over 30 years. She stopped being surprised by them a long time ago. Her name is Connie West. She grew up in this part of Nevada, and she has a way of talking about the strange things that happen near the base that is completely matter-of-fact, the way a person from coastal Maine might talk about fog. It is simply a feature of the environment. You account for it, and you move on. Connie's most repeated story involves a night in the late 1980s when she was driving home on the highway and noticed a light in the sky that was not behaving the way lights in the sky behave. It was not moving in an arc. It was not blinking in the pattern of any aircraft she had ever seen. It was hovering, completely still, at an altitude she could not judge because she had no reference point for its size. Then, without any acceleration she could perceive, it was somewhere else. Not moving there. Just there. She pulled over. She sat in her truck for a while. Then she drove home, made coffee, and did not tell anyone for 2 years because she did not think anyone would believe her, and she was not sure it mattered. What she says now, decades later, is that the experience was not frightening. It was humbling. There is a difference, she explains, and that difference is important. To understand why people in Rachel and the surrounding valleys see what they see, you have to understand what Area 51 actually is. The base, officially known as the Nevada Test and Training Range, Groom Lake Facility, was established in 1955 as a remote testing ground for the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, a project run jointly by the CIA and Lockheed's Skunk Works Division. The location was chosen specifically for its isolation. The dry lake bed provided a natural runway nearly 4 miles long. The surrounding mountains made visual surveillance from outside nearly impossible. And the existing Nevada test site, where the military had been conducting nuclear weapons tests since 1951, meant the entire region was already restricted and already watched. What followed over the next several decades was a program of aircraft testing so advanced that the vehicles being flown over that valley looked, to anyone watching from the highway below, like nothing that should exist. The U-2 could fly at altitudes above 70,000 feet, far higher than any commercial aircraft, and when it caught the last light of the setting sun while flying above a valley already in darkness, it appeared as a bright, hovering point of light moving in complete silence. The SR-71 Blackbird, tested at Groom Lake throughout the 1960s, could travel at speeds exceeding Mach 3. When it broke the sound barrier above the valley, the boom reached the ground like a physical force, shaking windows and houses 15 miles away. People who did not know what they were hearing thought it was an earthquake. Some of them still do not know what it was. This is the official explanation for many of the sightings around Area 51. Classified aircraft, experimental technology, black budget programs that the military had every reason to keep secret, and no obligation to explain to civilians living on the edge of the restricted zone. It is a sensible, verifiable, historically documented explanation. And it accounts for some of what people in Rachel have seen over the years, but not all of it. And the people who grew up there know the difference. Joe Travis was born in 1962 in Alamo, Nevada, a small town about 40 miles southeast of Rachel. His family ran cattle on land that had been in their possession since the 1920s, and he spent his childhood on horseback, covering ground that most Americans will never see. He knew the desert the way some people know their own kitchen. He knew what belonged there and what did not. In the summer of 1979, when Joe was 17 years old, he was checking a fence line on the eastern edge of his family's grazing allotment, a section of high desert scrub at an elevation of about 6,000 feet. It was mid-morning. The sky was clear. He was working alone because ranch work often meant working alone. He heard his horse react before he saw anything. The animal stopped moving and went rigid in a way Joe had never seen before and never saw again in 30 more years of working with horses. He looked up. What he saw was a craft. He uses that word specifically and deliberately. Not a light. Not an object. A craft. It was below the ridgeline of the mountain in front of him, which meant it was operating at an altitude of perhaps 300 to 400 feet above the valley floor. It was roughly triangular in shape, though the edges were not crisp the way the edges of a man-made vehicle are crisp. It moved without any sound he could detect. It moved slowly, and then it did not move at all, and then it was gone. And the entire encounter lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Joe did not report it. He was 17, and he had cattle to account for, and a horse that needed calming down. And what would he have reported it to anyway? The sheriff's department in Alamo had 4 deputies covering an area larger than some eastern states. He went home that evening and ate dinner with his parents and said nothing. He has told this story publicly exactly 3 times in his life, and each time he tells it, he says the same thing at the end. He says he does not know what it was. He says he knows what it was not. And he says there is a version of honesty that requires you to hold both of those things at the same time without forcing them into a resolution they are not ready for. The Travis family's land bordered the Nevada test site to the north and the Nellis Air Force Range to the west. They were, without choosing it, living inside one of the most heavily surveilled and restricted corridors in the United States. And yet the military had never approached them, never debriefed them, never asked them to sign anything. They were simply ranchers grazing cattle on federal land, invisible to the machinery of secrecy surrounding them, watching the sky, because that is what you do when the sky is the most interesting thing available. There is a woman named Linda Lovelace, no relation to anyone famous, who was born in 1958 in Tonopah, Nevada, and who spent most of her adult life working as a nurse at a small clinic in Hawthorne before retiring to a property outside of Rachel in the early 2000s. Linda is the kind of person who does not embellish. She spent 4 decades in medicine, and she is allergic to imprecision, the way some people are allergic to pollen. When she talks about what she has seen in the sky above her property, she talks about it the way she would describe a patient's symptoms: observable, specific, documented in her personal journal with dates and times. Between 2004 and 2019, Linda recorded 47 separate incidents in that journal. Not all of them were remarkable. Many were lights she could not immediately identify, but which she later reasoned were probably military exercises or drone tests. But 11 of the 47 she has never been able to explain. Not because the explanations are not available to her. She is intelligent enough to have considered every conventional explanation, but because the conventional explanations do not fit what she observed. The objects she could not explain moved in ways that violated what she understands about physics. They stopped instantly from high speed. They turned at angles that would destroy any known aircraft. They appeared and disappeared without trajectory. What Linda finds most interesting is not the objects themselves. It is what happened in the valley afterward, in the hours and sometimes days following the appearances she could not explain. She noticed it first in 2007, after an incident she describes as the most vivid of the 47. The morning after, she drove into Rachel to pick up mail and ran into 2 other residents at the post office. Both of them had seen something the previous night. Neither of them had told anyone. All 3 of them stood in the parking lot of a post office in a town with fewer than 100 residents and compared notes in quiet voices, and all 3 of them described the same object, moving in the same direction at the same time. That, Linda says, is what keeps her up at night. Not the object, the silence around it, the practiced, communal, decades-long agreement not to speak about what everyone in that valley has seen at one point or another. She does not believe the silence is fear. She believes it is something more complicated than fear. She believes it is a kind of respect for the weight of what they are sitting with, a recognition that some things are too large for casual conversation, and that speaking about them carelessly does more damage than staying quiet. She has been breaking that silence, carefully, for the last 5 years. The man who changed Linda's mind about speaking publicly was not a journalist or a researcher or a government whistleblower. He was a retired electrical engineer named Dennis Marr, who moved to a property 12 miles outside of Rachel in 2009 after his wife passed away, and he decided he wanted to spend whatever time he had left somewhere quiet. Dennis had spent his career working defense contracts. He had the kind of security clearance that does not get talked about at dinner parties. He knew what classified programs looked like from the inside, and he knew, better than most civilians ever would, exactly how much the government was capable of hiding, and for how long. Dennis did not move to the Nevada desert because of Area 51. He moved there because the land was cheap, and the silence was real, and he was 71 years old, and done with noise. But within his first year on the property, he started seeing things in the sky that he recognized, and things he did not. The things he recognized because he had spent 40 years in defense electronics, and he knew the signatures of classified aircraft well enough to identify categories even without knowing specific programs. The things he did not recognize troubled him in a precise, technical way, not emotionally, professionally. He started keeping records, not a journal the way Linda did. Engineering logs, timestamps, bearings, estimated altitudes, duration of observation, behavioral characteristics. He cross-referenced his observations with publicly available air traffic data and known military exercise schedules. He eliminated everything that could be explained. What remained, he organized into a separate document that he labeled simply, in the dry language of a man who had spent his life in technical fields, an unresolved. By 2014, the unresolved document was 19 pages long. Dennis shared it with nobody for 3 years. Then he met Linda at the Rachel post office, which is where everyone in that valley eventually meets, and they started talking. And within an hour, he knew she was someone he could show it to. She read all 19 pages in one sitting at his kitchen table while he made coffee and stood at the window looking out at the mountains. When she finished, she looked up and said, quietly, that she had 47 entries in her own journal and that at least 11 of them matched events in his document. Not approximately matched. Matched exactly. Same dates, same directions, same behavioral signatures. They sat with that for a long time. What Dennis believed, after 40 years in defense work and 5 years of personal observation in the Nevada desert, was not that the government was hiding alien spacecraft at Area 51. He was too precise a thinker for a conclusion that large. What he believed was that there were objects operating in the airspace above that valley that did not belong to any program he had knowledge of, and that his knowledge was extensive enough that the gap was significant. He believed that whatever those objects were, they had been operating in that airspace for a very long time. And he believed that the people who grew up in that valley and saw them regularly and said nothing had arrived, through decades of quiet observation, at something closer to the truth than anything published in a newspaper or broadcast on television. He died in 2021. Linda still has his engineering logs. She keeps them in a fireproof box under her bed, alongside her own journal. She has not decided what to do with them yet. The question of what is actually happening at Area 51 has never been fully answered, and it is important to understand why that ambiguity is not the same as mystery for its own sake. The United States government has a documented history of conducting operations in the Nevada desert that it actively concealed from the public for decades. The U-2 program, the SR-71, the A-12 ox cart, the F-117 stealth fighter, which was tested at Groom Lake for years before it was publicly acknowledged. Each of these programs, when it was eventually declassified, explained a category of sightings that civilians had been reporting for years and being dismissed for. And each declassification raised the same uncomfortable question. If they hid those programs, what else are they hiding? The answer, almost certainly, is more programs. The government does not stop classifying things because it once declassified some things. The black budget of the United States military is estimated at somewhere above $50 billion annually, and that is an estimate built from publicly available data on a system specifically designed to obscure its own scale. There are programs operating out of facilities like Area 51 right now that will not be publicly acknowledged for another 20 or 30 years. Some of what people in Rachel are seeing tonight, if they are looking at the sky tonight, is those programs. But some of it is not. And that is the part that even Dennis Marr, with his engineering logs and his security clearances and his 40 years of defense work, could not explain away. That is the part that the ranchers and the nurses and the bar owners and the retired engineers who grew up next to the most secret military installation on the planet have been sitting with for decades. Not in fear, not in excitement, in the careful, patient, practiced way of people who have learned to hold uncertainty without needing to resolve it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from living somewhere long enough. It is not book knowledge, and it is not the knowledge that comes from research or investigation or journalism. It is the knowledge that accumulates in a body over years of paying attention to the same landscape, the same sky, the same rhythms of weather and light, and the particular quality of silence in a high desert valley at 3 in the morning when nothing is moving and the stars are very close. The people who grew up next to Area 51 have that knowledge. And what they say, when they are willing to say anything at all, is consistent in a way that is difficult to dismiss. They say the sky above that valley behaves differently than other skies. Not always, not even often, but sometimes in a way that has no ordinary explanation. They say the objects they have seen do not move the way any aircraft moves, including experimental aircraft, because they have watched experimental aircraft their entire lives, and they know the difference. They say the experiences leave them not afraid, but altered, in the way that any genuine encounter with something larger than your existing understanding of the world leaves you altered. And they say the silence they have maintained is not denial. It is dignity. A recognition that some questions are too serious for the casual noise of public discourse. A teenager named Marisol Reyes grew up on a small horse property about 8 miles west of Rachel. Her family had been in that part of Nevada for 3 generations. She was 14 years old in the summer of 2011, when she had an experience she has described in careful, measured terms in 2 interviews since turning 18. She was outside after midnight on a warm July night, unable to sleep, sitting on the fence rail of the home paddock watching the horses. The horses, she noticed, had all moved to the center of the paddock, which was unusual. They were standing very close together, and they were not moving. She recognized this as the behavior horses display when they sense a predator. But there was no predator in that valley large enough to threaten a horse, and she knew it. She looked up because she did not know what else to do. Above the ridge to the northwest, at an altitude she estimated at perhaps 1,000 feet, there was an object unlike anything she had seen before. It was not a light. It was a structure with lights. She could perceive depth and dimension and mass. It was roughly circular, and it was completely silent, and it moved at a speed she describes as unhurried, the way something moves when it is not concerned about being seen. So it passed from northwest to southeast across her field of view in approximately 90 seconds, and then it moved behind the southern ridge and was gone. The horses did not relax for another 10 minutes. Marisol went inside and wrote down everything she could remember. She did not tell her parents. She did not tell her friends. She told nobody until she was 19 years old, and by then, she had spent 5 years examining every possible conventional explanation and finding them insufficient. She is 26 now, and she works in data analytics in Reno, and she is articulate and precise and completely serious. When she talks about that July night, she does not use language like alien or UFO. She says she witnessed an unidentified structured aerial vehicle operating in restricted airspace, with no visible means of propulsion, no sound signature, and behavioral characteristics inconsistent with any known aircraft platform. She says she doesn't know what it was. She says she knows she saw it. She says those 2 things together are enough. The pattern that emerges from these accounts and from the dozens of other accounts collected from residents of the Rachel and Alamo and Tonopah areas over the past 4 decades is not a pattern of delusion or exaggeration or attention-seeking. It is a pattern of restraint. People seeing things they cannot explain and choosing silence not because they are frightened, but because they are serious. Because they understand that the space between what they witnessed and what they can prove is a space that deserves to be treated with care. Because they live 40 miles from the most classified installation in the United States, and they have spent their lives learning that what you see and what you are allowed to say about what you see are 2 very different categories. What is at Area 51 right now, in the spring of 2024, is unknown. The base has expanded significantly in the satellite imagery available from commercial providers. New structures have appeared on the Groom Lake drybed over the past decade. The restricted airspace has been extended in ways that were not publicly announced. Whatever is being tested there, whatever is flying over that valley tonight, is more advanced than anything the public knows about. That is not speculation. That is simply the nature of a program that has been at the cutting edge of aerospace development for 70 years. Whether any of what is flying over that valley is not from here is a question that the United States government has, in recent years, stopped treating as obviously absurd. The intelligence community, in 2021, released a preliminary assessment of unidentified aerial phenomena that acknowledged 143 incidents reported by military aviators that could not be explained by known aircraft or natural phenomena. In 2023, a former intelligence official named David Grush testified under oath before a congressional committee that the government possesses, and has possessed for decades, materials and craft of non-human origin. He did not testify to this as rumor or speculation. He testified to it as something he was directly informed of through official channels during his career. The people in Rachel have not been watching the news coverage of these developments with excitement. They have been watching it with the particular quiet satisfaction of people who have known something for a very long time and have finally, after decades of patience, heard someone else say it out loud. They do not feel vindicated exactly. Vindication implies they were in a contest. They were not in a contest. They were simply paying attention to the sky above their valley and telling the truth about what they saw, carefully, to the people they trusted, over the course of their entire lives. Connie West still runs the Little Ale Inn. She is older now, and she moves more slowly, but she still collects the photographs and the drawings and the handwritten accounts that people leave on their way through Rachel, still hangs them on walls that are running out of space, still tells her story about the truck pulled over on the highway and the light that was, simply, instantaneously, somewhere else. She does not claim to know what it was. She does not need to. She saw it. It was real. The desert around her is full of things that are real and cannot be fully explained. And she has made her peace with that, the way a person makes peace with any large and unresolvable truth. She has stopped waiting for the explanation. She has started simply living in the presence of the question. That, in the end, is what it means to grow up next to Area 51. Not to have answers, to have proximity to something vast and serious and only partially visible, the way you have proximity to a mountain range that goes below the ground as far as it rises above it. The people who have lived their whole lives in that valley carry what they have seen the way the mountains carry their roots, quietly, deeply, without needing anyone else to confirm the weight of it. The highway through Rachel is empty most nights. The stars are very close. And somewhere in the restricted airspace to the west, in the darkness above the dry lake bed and the unmarked mountains, something is flying that most of the world does not know about. The people who grew up next to it look up sometimes, out of habit, out of respect, out of the honest human need to keep paying attention to the things that matter. And then they go inside, and they make coffee, and they do not say very much at all.